My name is Courtney Bennett, 31, a senior financial analyst living in Charlotte, North Carolina. A few weeks ago, I walked into the family company I'd been quietly keeping alive for 4 years, and my own mother pointed at the door and screamed in front of everyone, "Never show up here again." My younger brother Tyler was standing right there, laughing, arms crossed, looking at me like I was nothing. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, turned around, and walked out. What they didn't know was that every single month I had been wiring the money that kept the lights on the trucks moving and their paychecks clearing. And what they really didn't know was whose name was actually behind that money, and what would happen the moment I stopped. Curious what I did next and how the whole place came crashing down around them. Stay with me, this gets intense. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss how this family drama completely exploded. Let's dive in. 4 years ago, my parents sat me down and begged for help. Bennett Freight Solutions, the trucking and warehousing company my dad Gregory Bennett had built from nothing, was weeks away from shutting its doors. The bank had already frozen the operating line of credit, vendors were demanding cash on delivery, and payroll was about to bounce. Mom and Dad looked 10 years older that night as they slid the financials across the kitchen table and asked if I could do anything. I was 27 then, making good money as a financial analyst, and I saw a way to keep the business alive without turning it into a public family rescue story. I agreed to provide monthly funds through a formal personal loan agreement routed through the escrow account of my lawyer, Patrick Walsh. The contract was airtight. Every month, I wired the money directly to escrow. Patrick released it to the company, and in return, I received full monthly financial reports, plus the right to inspect the books quarterly. Most importantly, the loan was structured as a convertible note. If the company ever missed a cure period after a formal default, the entire outstanding balance would automatically convert into 51% of the voting shares. To keep my name completely off public records and spare my parents the embarrassment of employees knowing their daughter was the lifeline, we set up a revocable trust managed by Patrick as the nominal lender. No one at the company ever saw my name on a single document. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. My job in Charlotte paid well enough that I could cover the monthly transfers, keep building my own savings, and still live comfortably. The reports Patrick forwarded every month showed the company slowly stabilizing cash flow, improved, a couple of new contracts came in, and for a while it looked like they might actually climb out of the hole. Then my younger brother, Tyler Bennett, 27 at the time, got fired from his sales job in Atlanta and moved back home. Within weeks, he talked Dad into putting him on payroll as an operations manager. Because the business still handled everything in-house and hadn't employed an outside CPA since 2018, internal controls were basically non-existent. Tyler was handed a corporate card for operational expenses with no spending limits and no one reviewing the statements. Dad trusted him completely. Mom thought it would keep him out of trouble, and the few longtime employees who raised eyebrows were told to mind their own business. At first, the extra charges were small enough to blend in, a couple hundred here. For meals, a few hotel nights there. I noticed them in the reports, but chalked it up to him getting settled. Then the numbers started climbing fast, and by the time I realized what was really happening, Tyler had already run the card into territory that no legitimate business expense could ever justify. I kept wiring the money every month because the alternative was watching the company, and everything my parents had worked for collapse overnight. But every transfer felt heavier than the last, because deep down I knew exactly where some of that cash was ending up, and I knew the day would come when the house of cards finally fell. I just never imagined it would fall the way it did, or that the people who begged me to save them would be the same ones screaming at me to get out and never come back. 2 months ago, the quarterly report Patrick sent me raised red flags I couldn't ignore anymore. I opened the attachments late one Friday night after work and started digging through the bank reconciliation first. Right there, in black and white, were transfers totaling over $32,000, routed to a personal PayPal account that definitely didn't belong to any vendor we used. The merchant codes on the corporate card statements told the rest of the story: repeated charges to online sportsbooks, offshore gaming sites, high-end retail stores in Miami and Las Vegas, even a few Cash App withdrawals flagged as personal. Every single one traced back to the card issued in Tyler's name. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the screen until the numbers blurred. $32,000 in less than 4 months, all on expenses that had nothing to do with freight or warehousing. My monthly wires had been covering payroll, fuel, and insurance, yet somehow there was still room for Tyler to treat the company account like his private ATM. The next morning, I drove straight to the yard on a Saturday, when I knew most employees wouldn't be around. Tyler was leaning against his truck, scrolling through his phone as usual. I walked up, held out printed copies of the statements, and asked point blank what the charges were for. He barely glanced at the pages before shoving them back at me with a shrug. "I borrowed a little to cover some bad bets," he said, like it was no different than taking $20 from a friend's wallet. When I asked how he planned to pay it back, he just laughed and told me to relax, that he had a system, and it would all even out soon. There was no ledger, no repayment schedule, no shame. Just the same careless grin he'd worn since we were kids. I left the yard that afternoon with my stomach in knots and went straight to my parents' house. Mom Valerie Bennett answered the door, still in her robe, even though it was past noon, and Dad Gregory Bennett was at the kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee. I laid the statements out in front of them and walked them through every suspicious line item. Instead of shock or anger, I got excuses. Mom reached across the table and patted my hand, telling me Tyler was going through a rough patch and that family sticks together no matter what. Dad barely looked up from his mug long enough to mutter that boys will be boys, and I was overreacting by bringing printouts like some kind of auditor. When I pointed out that the money I sent every month was now directly funding gambling debts, Mom's eyes welled up and she asked why I couldn't just give him a little more time. Dad finally met my gaze and said the company needed unity right now, not me making waves over a few charges. I stood there listening to them defend the exact behavior that was bleeding the business dry and felt something inside me shift. For years, I had accepted their favoritism as just the way things were, but hearing them dismiss $32,000 of outright misuse as a rough patch made it impossible to keep pretending it was fine. I gathered the papers, told them I wasn't wiring another dollar until every cent was accounted for and repaid, and walked out before either of them could lay on another guilt trip. Driving home that evening, I kept replaying Mom's teary plea and Dad's dismissive shrug, wondering how many more times I was expected to clean up messes I didn't make. The quarterly inspection right I had written into the loan agreement suddenly felt like my only leverage, and for the first time I started thinking about what would happen if I actually used it. Little did I know the bank was about to force everyone's hand long before I was ready. Last month, the lender served a formal notice of default that landed like a bomb. The document showed up by certified mail at the company's main office in Charlotte, stating that Bennett Freight Solutions had 30 days to cure a shortfall of $475,000. If the full amount wasn't paid by the deadline, the bank would accelerate the entire loan balance and begin foreclosure proceedings on the terminal's trucks and warehouse. The notice also froze any further draws on the operating line, which meant the company couldn't even cover next week's diesel without dipping into money that no longer existed. Dad called an emergency meeting for the following Monday morning and begged me to be there. I already knew what was coming, but I showed up anyway because Patrick had warned me this was the exact trigger event written into my convertible note. When I walked into the conference room, more than a dozen longtime employees were already packed around the table, some still in uniforms, others clutching coffee, like it might be their last free cup. The air felt thick enough to choke on. Dad started by passing out copies of the notice and explaining that the bank wasn't bluffing this time. He talked about missed covenant tests and rising interest rates, then turned to me and said the only realistic option was for me to wire the cure amount immediately. Mom sat beside him, nodding, hard eyes red from crying all weekend. Tyler leaned against the wall in the back with his arms folded, watching the room like this was someone else's problem. I asked for specifics on where the shortfall had come from, since my monthly transfers had always covered the scheduled principal and interest payments. Dad hesitated, glanced at Mom, and finally admitted that cash had been diverted to keep operations running after some bad months. Tyler shifted his weight, but stayed silent. A couple of drivers exchanged looks, and the HR manager, Lisa, tried to keep her face neutral while clutching the notice so tight the paper crumpled. Mom couldn't stay quiet any longer. She stood up, face flushed, and pointed straight at me in front of everyone. "If you don't wire the money today, never show up here again," she shouted, voice cracking on the last word. The room went dead silent. A few employees stared at the table. One mechanic in the corner actually gasped. Tyler pushed off the wall, stepped closer, and added just loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Yeah, just leave Courtney," with that same smirk he'd worn the day I confronted him in the parking lot. Lisa tried to calm things down, saying, "Maybe we could all take a break and talk privately," but Mom wasn't having it. She kept going, telling me I had always acted like I was better than the rest of the family, and now was the moment to prove I actually cared. Dad just sat there rubbing his temples, refusing to look at me. Whispers started rippling through the room about whether payroll would even clear this Friday, and I could feel every pair of eyes bouncing between me and my parents. I stayed calm, folded my copy of the notice, and slid it back across the table. I told them I wasn't wiring another cent until a full forensic review explained exactly where the money had gone over the past year, especially the $32,000 that had vanished on Tyler's card. Mom's face twisted like I had slapped her, and she started yelling that I was trying to destroy everything they had built. Tyler snorted and muttered something about me finally showing my true colors. That was the moment something inside me shut off completely. I stood up, slowly looked Mom straight in the eye, and told her I was sorry she felt that way. Then I turned to the room, apologized to the employees for the uncertainty they were facing through no fault of their own, and walked to the door. Mom screamed after me that I was abandoning my own blood, but I didn't stop. Tyler's laugh followed me down the hallway, sharp and ugly. I stepped outside into the bright Charlotte morning, took a deep breath, and smiled for the first time in weeks, because the default clock had just started ticking on my terms. By the time I reached my car, I already had Patrick's number pulled up, ready to set everything in motion that should have happened a long time ago. Jun Jacques Han, Ju Moi, Yo Kao Kong Sot GM Now. Bat Jiao Viet, Fan Fiving A. Part 5, 964 words. That same night, I drove to Patrick Walsh's office, even though it was well past regular hours. He had already cleared his evening when I called from the parking lot after leaving the company, and the lights in his downtown Charlotte suite were still on when I arrived. My best friend Jenna Brooks came with me for moral support, and my coworker Shane Coleman, who handles distressed assets at the fund, met us there because he understood the numbers better than anyone. Patrick had the original loan documents, the trust agreement, and the convertible note spread across the conference table like a battle map. We went through every clause line by line. The default was undeniable. The lender's notice of default had been served. The 30-day cure period was ticking, and no payment had been made. Under Section 4.2 of the note, failure to cure automatically triggered conversion of the entire outstanding principal, plus accrued interest, into 51% of the company's voting equity. Patrick confirmed the math with all the monthly advances over 4 years. My claim now exceeded the threshold by a comfortable margin. I signed the execution paperwork right there, authorizing immediate conversion and directing Patrick to file the necessary notices. He prepared 3 documents on the spot: a formal notice of conversion addressed to the company's registered agent, a demand letter giving them 14 calendar days to repay the full loan balance, or accept the conversion as final, and a courtesy copy for my parents marked personal and confidential. Everything went into FedEx envelopes for guaranteed overnight delivery Monday morning, and Patrick also sent scanned copies by email with read receipt tracking, so there would be no plausible deniability. Jenna sat quietly while I signed page after page, squeezing my hand when I paused on the last signature line. Shane reviewed the equity transfer language one more time and nodded that it was bulletproof. By the time we finished, it was almost midnight, but the weight that had been crushing me for years finally started lifting. For the first time since I had agreed to help, the power dynamic was no longer tilted entirely against me. Patrick walked us to the elevator and promised to call the moment delivery was confirmed. Jenna drove me home because my hands were still shaking too much to grip the wheel properly. Shane texted later that night saying the fund's legal team had already been looped in anonymously and was standing by if things escalated. I asked both of them to keep everything completely quiet for now. No social media hints, no office gossip, nothing that could tip my family off before the notices landed. The next 2 weeks, I went to work every day like nothing had changed on the surface. I attended meetings, ran my models, and smiled in the hallway while my phone stayed silent from the usual family numbers. Patrick confirmed delivery on Tuesday morning and forwarded the signed receipt from the registered agent. The 14-day clock started running, and I spent every evening reviewing the company's public filings and vendor contracts, preparing for whatever came next. Jenna checked in daily with takeout and wine, making sure I ate and slept. Shane quietly pulled credit reports on the company and mapped out which assets were encumbered and which might still be salvageable. Neither of them asked if I was sure. They both knew this had been building for years, and that walking away without protecting myself was no longer an option. By the end of those 14 days, I had memorized every detail of what I now legally controlled, and I was ready for the fallout I knew was coming. The notices had done their job. The loan was officially in default, the conversion was recorded, and for the first time in 4 years, the next move belonged entirely to me. 7 weeks after the conversion notice was served, everything collapsed faster than even Patrick had predicted. It started with payroll. The scheduled direct deposits for the remaining drivers and warehouse staff simply never arrived on Friday morning. By noon, the office manager was fielding frantic calls from employees whose rent checks had bounced and whose banks were charging overdraft fees. Within 48 hours, more than half the workforce handed in resignation letters or just stopped showing up. The few who stayed were mostly the ones too close to retirement to start over somewhere else, and even they spent most of their shifts on their phones looking for new jobs. The following Monday, the bank made its move. A crew showed up at the main terminal with foreclosure paperwork and began placing bright orange repo stickers on every truck in the yard. Security gates were chained, warehouse doors padlocked, and tow trucks lined up to haul away anything with wheels. Vendors who had been extending credit for years suddenly demanded cash on delivery for even a single pallet, and fuel cards were declined at every pump from Charlotte to Raleigh. The operating account had been frozen solid the moment the cure period expired. That was when the phones started exploding. Mom called 17 times the first day the trucks were locked down, leaving voicemails that began with tears and ended with screaming accusations about how I was destroying Dad's legacy. Dad tried a different approach the next morning, sending long texts about heart attacks and hospital visits that never actually happened, hoping guilt would work where anger had failed. Tyler alternated between furious voicemails threatening to sue me for everything I owned and drunken ones at 2 a.m. begging me to just fix it like you always do. I let every call roll straight to voicemail and every text stay on read. Patrick had already instructed me to forward anything that crossed into harassment, and after the third death threat-sounding message from Tyler, he filed a police report just in case. Jenna came over most evenings with groceries because I had stopped leaving the apartment except for work. She sat on my couch, deleting notifications as they poured in, so I wouldn't have to see Mom's name flash across the screen another 100 times. Shane ran quiet searches on the company's remaining contracts and confirmed what we already suspected: most customers had already started rerouting freight to competitors the moment word spread that Bennett trucks were sitting idle behind chain-link fences. By the end of that week, the terminal looked like a ghost yard. Weeds were already pushing through cracks in the concrete, and the only movement came from repo drivers cataloging equipment for auction. Local news even ran a short segment about another family trucking company closing its doors after decades in business, complete with file footage of padlocked gates that had been taken from our lot. I watched it once on mute, then turned the television off, and went back to reviewing asset schedules Patrick had sent over. The constant ringing eventually slowed to a trickle as batteries died and hope ran out. The last message I bothered to listen to was Mom whispering through sobs that they were losing the house because the bank had accelerated the home equity line that was cross-collateralized with the business loans. I saved the voicemail the way Patrick told me to, then blocked the number and added it to the growing list. Every communication now went through counsel. My direct lines were silent for the first time in years. Those 7 weeks felt both endless and lightning fast. I slept better than I had in ages because the decisions were finally made and the consequences were no longer mine to prevent. The company I had kept alive with my own paycheck was dying exactly the way it would have years earlier if I had never stepped in, and watching it happen from a safe distance brought a strange kind of peace. The fallout was brutal, but it was honest, and for once, it wasn't landing on my shoulders alone. 11 weeks after I walked out that door, Bennett Freight's assets went to court-supervised auction in a packed Charlotte warehouse. Patrick had spent the previous month negotiating a clean sale of my newly converted 51% stake to the private equity fund where I worked. The transaction kept everything above board and eliminated any conflict of interest. When the auction opened, our fund submitted the winning bid, acquiring the truck's terminal's customer contracts and remaining goodwill for a fraction of what the company had once been worth. The judge's gavel fell, the bankruptcy trustee signed off, and on a quiet Friday afternoon, the new owners took possession. Monday morning, I walked back through the same front doors I had left months earlier, this time wearing a tailored suit and carrying the title of Chief Executive Officer. The fund had appointed me to lead the turnaround because I already knew every route, every vendor, and every weakness in the operation. A skeleton crew of loyal employees who had weathered the storm greeted me with cautious smiles. I gathered everyone in the freshly painted conference room and laid out the new direction: leaner operations, honest books, and zero tolerance for financial misconduct. Then I asked Gregory Bennett, Valerie Bennett, and Tyler Bennett to step into my office. They had shown up unannounced, thinking the auction meant they still had some claim to the place. Dad looked thinner. Mom's eyes were swollen, and Tyler kept shifting from foot to foot like he needed a restroom. I closed the door, slid 3 termination letters across the desk, and watched their faces change as they read the words, "Immediate termination for gross financial misconduct," supported by a 50-page forensic audit the fund had commissioned. The report detailed every unauthorized transfer, every gambling charge, every dollar of company money spent on personal luxury, while payroll bounced. Dad started to speak, first voice cracking about 35 years of building something from nothing. Mom burst into fresh tears and reached for my hand, begging me to remember she was still my mother. Tyler went pale, then red, then finally managed to stammer that he was sorry and would pay everything back if I just gave him one more chance. I let them finish. When the room fell silent again, I explained in a calm, even tone that the person who had kept this company afloat for 4 years with monthly wires none of them ever saw coming was sitting right in front of them. The lender they had screamed at, threatened, and disowned was now the majority owner and their new boss. The realization hit them like separate punches. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Dad sank into a chair as if his legs had given out. Tyler just stared, mouth open, unable to form another word. I told them security would escort them out within 5 minutes, and that any future communication would go through legal counsel only. Attempts to contact me directly would be treated as trespassing. Mom tried one last desperate plea about family and forgiveness. I looked her in the eye and said the family that mattered now was the one still willing to show up and do honest work. Security walked them to the parking lot. I watched from the window as Mom collapsed against the car, sobbing Dad guiding her inside without looking back, and Tyler standing frozen until a guard pointed him toward the exit. That was the last time I ever saw any of them in person. 6 months later, the restructured company, now operating under a cleaner name, was profitable again. We sold off underperforming routes, renegotiated every vendor contract, and brought in a professional CPA firm. The fund promoted me to managing director for delivering one of the fastest turnarounds in its portfolio. My apartment downtown finally felt like home instead of a temporary stop. Jenna and Shane celebrated with me over steak and champagne toasting to boundaries finally enforced. Today, Gregory and Valerie live in a small rental after the bank foreclosed on the family home. Tyler bounced between odd jobs before moving several states away. Last I heard, he was facing collection agencies for the personal debts he racked up. They made their choices, and those choices had consequences none of them saw coming. Here's what I learned the hard way. Rescuing people who refuse to rescue themselves only delays the crash and guarantees you'll be standing in the wreckage with them. Setting a boundary isn't cruel, it's survival. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone who keeps taking advantage of your love is to stop giving them anything left to take. That's my story, from silent lender to majority owner to the one who finally closed the door for good. If you made it to the end, thank you truly for listening. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had to cut ties with family to protect your own peace? How did you do it? Like, share, and subscribe if this resonated. I read every single comment. See you in the next one. 1. Giai.